we're at a key point in the arc of the course here. If you think about the diagram that I used to introduce it, this thing, we're at the halfway point on this. We've talked about everything that was in the green, about the quadrant labeled non-naturalism, about reasons, and the one at the top labeled pragmatic metalinguistic expressivism. And now we're going to talk about the scientific naturalism side of things. Sellars starts off the essay with a phrase that has often been quoted from it, saying, the job of the philosophers is to say how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of that term. I think this is often thought of as a folksy, informal way of indicating the scope of the philosopher's interest. I think we're in a position to hear it with two special overtones that the folk may miss. One is there's a nominalist tone to this, how things, particulars, hang together. Particulars in the broadest sense of the term, he's going to include lots of things under that heading, hang together in the broadest possible sense of that term. Well, he's not a mereology fan, but he doesn't think they hang together by standing in relations to each other, by being components of facts together. He has a picture of them hanging together the way Leo the lion and Leonina the lion hang together by both being lions. So he's going to be interested in special ways in which things, particulars in the broadest sense, can hang together. As I say, I don't think that nominalist undertone is typically appreciated. The other thing is, he really has a much more specific view about the kind of unification, the kind of hanging together that philosophers are supposed to be doing. In PSIM, Philosophy of the Scientific Image of Man, it's Eddington's Two Tables, which from a famous lecture that he gave that I put on this supplementary reading. I think in the end, it's not so much Eddington's Two Tables as Eddington's colleague, C.P. Snow's Two Cultures that need to be put together. But that corresponds to the two sort of halves diagonally of this diagram. We're going around it clockwise. As I learned to think about things shaped like this, we've looked at the land of the Munchkins and the Gillikins. We have to get to the Winkies and the Quadlings yet. You don't have to think of it that way if you don't want. But to appreciate the sort of transition that's involved, we really need to go back to what I was talking about in the very first meeting of the seminar, and that is the Kantian revolution that replaces the distinction between minds and bodies, the Cartesian distinction, with a distinction between norms and facts, or at least matters of fact. And I described then how the German 19th century neo-Kantian tradition, beginning with Kuno Fischer, who was the Zurück nach Kant, back to Kant, man, set off the neo-Kantian movement, going through the two principal schools, the Marburg School and the Southwest School of neo-Kantians, and culminating, fading out in Ernst Cassirer. He's sort of the last official representative of that school, but them seizing on this distinction between normative concerns and matter-of-factual concerns, between the quid juris and the quid facti in Kant's terms, in order to find a place for philosophy in an age when science was finally fulfilling its theoretical and its practical promise in the laboratories and factories of 19th century Germany. They could say, no, the philosopher's concern is with normative matters, with justification in epistemology, with norms as they apply in art, and with the practical sphere of oughts. And those are things that the natural scientists in their laboratories are not going to find out. They're not going to tell us what we need to know about. Now, they had internal difficulties conceptually. Exactly what is the contrast term with the normative? Is it facts? Is it descriptions? Is it causes? Is it material stuff? Kant had drawn it in terms of the distinction between laws and conceptions of laws. We saw ultimately he draws it in terms of autonomy. They couldn't take that over. That was an internal sort of question for them, exactly how did you characterize the non-normative side of this divide? But the larger issue for them was struggling to keep this distinction from turning into a dualism. The Cartesian distinction between minds and bodies had notoriously turned into a dualism. I suggested you think about the difference, that a distinction becomes a dualism when it's drawn in terms that make it unintelligible how the distinguished items could relate to each other. And they always had a trouble saying how the normative world that the philosophers were to study fit into the material, matter-of-factual world of causes and laws of nature that were the proper realm of the natural scientist. I think Fred Weiser, who's written a lot in English about the 19th century German neo-Kantian tradition, is right to say they never came to a satisfactory resolution of that issue. They never got a stable story about what the relations between the two sides that they were fundamentally distinguishing were. And that this was something like the rock on which neo-Kantianism, German neo-Kantianism, foundered. But I also suggested that in the 20th century Anglophone philosophy, that C.I. Lewis was recognizably a neo-Kantian, giving a pragmatist twist to the normative side of things. And we've seen what woke Sellars from his dogmatic slumbers was seeing Carnap as a neo-Kantian, seeing Carnap as having a view of Kantian categories as metalinguistic concepts. But if you think that the biggest thing that happened in modern philosophy since Descartes was this Kantian revolution, was the enforcement of this distinction between the normative and the non-normative concepts or meta-concepts, Then this problem of how to talk about the relation between them, how to get them to fit into one vision, one stereoscopic vision, but still into one vision. That's the philosophical question of our time. And Anglophone philosophy, by and large, for the first 3/4 of the 20th century, had nothing to say about this issue, just ignored it. Well, they had other stuff going on, logic was rising, and so on. There was a worry about how specifically moral normativity could find a place in a vision with the world of science. And of course, there was good and important work done there. And I've urged, without here giving the arguments that would be required to entitle us to that conclusion, that the later Wittgenstein had this as his principal issue, how norms implicit in social practice should be understood in relation to what the natural sciences are doing. And starting in the 1980s, speaking on Wittgenstein's behalf, or anyway in a reading of Wittgenstein, Kripke re-raised the issue of normativity under the heading of the rule-following considerations. I think that discussion did not appreciate the sort of global character of the issue, but it brought us, that is, it tended to think of it as a narrowly semantic issue in the way that moral theorists had tended to think of thinking how normativity fit into the world of material things studied by natural science, as specifically about moral issues. But seeing it as a semantic issue is certainly on the way to the Kantian revolutionary view that discursivity, or character as concept-using creatures, is fundamentally a normative capacity, has to be understood in normative terms. So I think the way was opened up to seeing this issue in something like the way Sellars did. And Pittsburgh made its contribution in the 90s, McDowell's Mind and World, my Making It Explicit, were both in their way arguing for this Kantian picture of what the philosophic enterprise is in our time, that the challenge is to integrate the picture of normativity and the picture of natural science. Anyway, Sellars in the 60s takes this as his life work. This is the most important philosophical question that there is. It's what he had in mind when he said that he hoped the effect of his work would be to move analytic philosophy from its Humean to its Kantian phase. Taking this distinction between normative space of reasons and the scientific naturalist space of causes of matters of fact. And I think that's why he took this essay, Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, to be at the center of his work, that in order to understand the particular topics that he wrote about and the constraints on that he was operating with, the criteria of adequacy that he was operating with, you needed to see this large question. You needed to see everything as oriented by addressing this question. And when I titled this seminar, Sellars as a Metaphysician, that's the metaphysical question. It's that Kantian metaphysical question that I I see him as principally addressing. And of course, he doesn't think that he solves the problem in this essay. He sort of does think he solves it in Science and Metaphysics, or at any rate makes the crucial moves there. But here, he's setting out the problem. He's indicating the most important puzzle pieces, sketching at least the principal constraints or criteria of adequacy on a solution, and at least gesturing in the direction that he thought was most promising for assembling those puzzle pieces so as to satisfy those criteria. So, when I say the material we're talking about today is pivotal in the course, we've seen the sort of non-naturalist side, the normative side, the metalinguistic reading of fundamental, in particular Kantian categorical concepts, his nominalism about abstract objects, last week his metalinguistic approach to alethic modal expressions, but he would find the focus in the last 40 years or so of Anglophone philosophy on alethic modality and metaphysics done in terms of that as blinkered, as short-sighted, precisely insofar as its normative modalities, deontic, rather than alethic, that he sees as the fundamental puzzle, and of course in terms of which he wanted to understand the alethic modal as well. Now, as this diagram again indicates, the split between the green bits and the yellow bits on it is overcharacterized. We can see that it's the coincidence of a number of distinctions which are related but by no means identical to one another. And the extent to which one of the issues we need to think about is the extent to which Sellars is just running these all together in a thoughtless way, or the sense in which he's giving us an articulated account of the relations between them and arguing that a number of them line up with one another. So in the plan for this session that I put on the website to orient us a little, I indicate 7 different ways in which this split, the Kantian divide, I'll say, gets drawn, most of which are represented in that diagram. So one of them is the difference between 36ers and 42ers, as we put it when we first started reading Sellars, between the space of reason's non-naturalism and scientific naturalism, between his statement that in calling something a bit of knowledge, we're not describing it, we're doing something else, we're placing it in the space of reasons and justification on the one hand, and on the other hand, the scientia mensura in the space of describing, in the dimension of describing and explaining. Science is the measure of all things, of those that are that they are, and of those that are not that they're not. So that was the division that Rorty seized on as distinguishing the left-wing and the right-wing Sellarsians. Rorty was prepared to basically throw up his hands in the face of this big Kantian question that Sellars says is the philosophical question of our time, and say, look, you just have to pick the left-hand side or the right-hand side, either space of reason's non-naturalism or scientific naturalism. You can't have both. There's a corresponding tension in Rorty's own view. On the one hand, as a pragmatist, he wanted everything to be explained in broadly naturalist terms of us as beings who need to adapt to our environment, a sort of Deweyan view, and on the other hand, a picture of us as distinguished from everything else by living and moving and having our being in a space of vocabularies and being the kind of being that could transform ourselves by redescribing ourselves, by using a different vocabulary. And I've argued in other places that Rorty himself never reconciled these two thoughts that he had. So that's the left-wing, right-wing Sellarsian, section 36 and section 42 of EPM. A second one, obviously related, is part and parcel of Sellars' anti-descriptivism. And it's what we might call, following Hugh Price's terminology, an anti-descriptivist bifurcation that has normative, often the term prescriptive, Sellars uses here on the one side, and descriptive on the other side. Now, description and what's the job of natural scientists studying the material world? Well, in the Scantia Mensura, in the preamble to that, we have a connection being forged between those, picking out natural science as authoritative specifically in the dimension of description. We saw it coming hand in hand with explanation. I mentioned Hugh Price's term bifurcation here. Price is somebody who wants to give a non-representational subject naturalist account of all of our discursive practices, including the practices of natural science, and challenges people who are not global expressivists, but who are prepared to understand some regions of discourse in terms of representational semantics, describing how things are, not exactly the same thing as representation, but again, a close connection. And Price says anybody who isn't a global expressivist, but is an expressivist about some discourses, but a representationalist about other discourses, sees some discourses as descriptive in a representational way, and others as non-descriptive, has a bifurcation problem. You've got to say, well, what's the difference between these? How do you draw a line between the things that you should treat as descriptions and the things that you should not and cannot treat as descriptions? I mentioned last time the Geach ascriptivism article that marks the divide between first wave and second wave meta-ethical expressivism about specifically moral normativity. By the way, I added that to the website. It's only 4 or 5 pages long. I urge you to have a look at it. I put it in the suggested reading for last time. Geach's argument there is that you can't use certain tests for things being non-descriptive. You can't just look at the freestanding use of expressions and the force, pragmatic force, and the Freudian sense that they have. You've also got to look at the embedded uses, and that puts tremendous constraints on what you take a non-descriptivist approach to. This anti-descriptivism with a bifurcation between descriptive uses of language and non-descriptive ones. That's another way, and maybe the non-descriptive, anyway, the paradigm of those is prescriptive normative ones, but maybe there are a bunch of different kinds of expressivist accounts that one could give of the things one is not a descriptivist about. So that's clearly related to the space of reason's normative non-naturalism and the scientific naturalism, but it's not exactly the same. There's different issues involved if we're using the anti-descriptivism rhetoric. Norms and causes, or norms and facts, again, not just the same thing. What's the right contrast term for norms? Sellars is not going to put it in terms of norms and facts, because for him facts are on the normative side. Facts are a kind of abstraction. They're just a subset of propositions, the ones that are true. But to characterize something as the fact that things are thus and so is to invoke an abstraction, and to talk about truth is to talk about human practices for him. So it can't be a norm-fact distinction for him. And he has some interesting things to say about causes here in PSIM. Fourth divide we've seen, which he does not invoke in this essay, but we saw it comes up often in the discussion in the three abstraction essays, the world in the wide sense versus the world in the narrow sense, which he says of the wide sense that that's the one that includes discursive practices, human doings, and so on. I suggested that the best way to read that wide-narrow distinction, which he uses but doesn't explain in the abstraction essays, is in terms of dependence or independence on our practices. That the world in the narrow sense is the world described in a way that could still all be true of it if there had never been any discursive practitioners. The non-human world in that sense, but dependence or independence on our activities. In other places, I've argued that it's important when you talk about dependence and independence in general, but in this vicinity, to distinguish between sense dependence and reference dependence. And I think that matters here. One expression is reference dependent on another if there can't be things of the second kind unless they're things of the first kind. So, for instance, children and parents stand in a reference dependence relation. No parents, no children. No children, no parents. Sense dependence is that you couldn't grasp the concept of bees without grasping the concept of A's. And a sort of context in which it's important to make this distinction. Suppose I say, I have a concept of beauty, or because I'm going to give a cartoon version of it, let me call it Beauty Star, because the point is not to give an analysis of this aesthetic concept, such that something is beautiful star just in case a properly situated human observer would respond to it with pleasure. As I'm not suggesting this is an analysis of beauty, though people have. And now we ask, were there any beautiful sunsets, beautiful star sunsets, before there were any human beings? That is the concept of beauty star reference dependent on human beings? So that if there are no human beings, then there's nothing beautiful star. And the claim is, no, it's not. That definition established a sense dependence. You can't understand what beauty star is without understanding humans responding to things with pleasure. So you need to understand pleasure, you need to understand human beings and their responses in order to understand it. But something could have all the properties that would elicit pleasure from a human being if there were a human being there, even if there aren't any human beings and never were and never will be. That sort of response-dependent, the definition of a property is response-dependent, need not establish a reference dependence, a causal dependence of the thing you're defining on the response that it's defined in terms of. It's just a sense dependence. And this is a distinction that, maybe you can see is important in thinking about sort of idealism, folk idealism in a general sense. The fact that you can't say what a law is. You can't grasp the concept of a law without understanding counterfactually robust inferences. And you can't understand the concept of a fact without understanding the practice of asserting declarative sentences. And you can't understand the concept of an object or a property or a relation without understanding the use of expressions as singular terms and predicates. And none of that means that there couldn't be laws, facts, and objects with properties standing in relations unless there were discursive practitioners who were making inferences, making claims, and using singular terms and predicates. The only claim that's justified by that is a sense dependence claim, not a reference dependence claim. Well, I introduced the distinction between sense dependence and reference dependence in the context of thinking about Sellars' distinction between the world in a narrow sense and the world in the wide sense. Which kind of dependence is it that we're saying the world in the narrow sense is independent? Which sort of dependence are we denying? Is that a reference dependence or a sense dependence? And I think it's clear it's a reference dependence that he's denying. He's saying we're talking about the world the way it could be, even if there had never been people. So the kind of dependence that is denied by this criterion of being of a pertaining to the world in the narrow sense is reference dependence. There may be sense dependence on our practices. He need not deny that you couldn't understand what a particular is without understanding what it is to use an expression as a singular term. And that would not make the particularity of the inhabitants of the world in the narrow sense objectionably dependent on human practices. Okay, now that question of what features would the world have, even if there were no discursive practitioners, and what things are in the world only in the broader sense in which, well, norms of etiquette, say, are in the world. I mean, those are real, but they're real because of us. Without our interactions with each other, there would be no etiquette. And arguably, there'd be no moral norms either if there weren't persons to be bound by them. Would there be facts? Well, easier case for him. Would there be universals? To say no. To talk about universals is to talk meta-linguistically, and meta-languages are human creations, and the languages they talk about are human creations. No languages, no meta-linguistic facts as a matter of reference dependence. So I suggested this. Anyway, that's my hypothesis for what he means when he distinguishes the world in the narrow sense and the world in the wider sense, is that in specifying the world in the narrower sense, we're forbidden from using any concepts, attributing any properties or features to it that are reference dependent on the existence of discursive practices. Now, that's related to a norm fact, norm cause, to a prescription description, but not simply identical with it. Another distinction, which is more in play in this essay than you might think, though he's keeps it as a sub-theme, is the distinction between a world of facts and a world of particulars. For Sellars, as an ontological nominalist, that world in the narrow sense is a world of particulars, just of things, not of their properties and their relations and facts about them. All that stuff is over on the metalinguistic side, which is on the wide world in the wide sense side. Sixth distinction that's going with that big divide is his official topic in this essay, the manifest and scientific images. That's his preferred way of making the distinction here. We'll see that only 5 years later, when he gives his Locke lectures, he doesn't so much as mention the manifest image. He talks about the common sense conceptual framework that seems to be doing the same sort of work, but he's given up the specific rhetoric or conception that he has here. The seventh one, which he mentions in passing in a couple of places in this essay, but does not use to organize it, is the distinction between appearance and reality. In the Kantian sense of phenomena and noumena, what's phenomenally real and what's noumenally real. The distinction between things as they are in themselves and things as they are in relation to us, things as they appear to us. Now, the whole well, it's too strong. Anyway, an issue that looms large in the first critique, downstream from the division that Kant is making between things that are rulish in the normative sense and which depends on our conceptions of the rules, and things that are law-like, things that are as they are in themselves, is what we could call the Kantian problematic, is to say about features of our experience, which ones are as they are because we're the way we are, and which ones are as they are because the things that we're knowing and acting on are as they are. Now, and he wants to say, well, the fact that things stand in law-like relations to one another is actually not a feature of things as they are in themselves. That's reflecting features of our cognitive faculties. This is the Copernican revolution, is to say way more of the world you experience is really a feature of the world as it appears to creatures like us, not the way things are in themselves, thought of independently of their relation to us. It's a salutary exercise to go through the motivations for that Copernican revolution and the particular way Kant assigns things to different sides of it, mostly everything to the phenomenal side, to go through it and be careful about the distinction between reference dependence and sense dependence at every stage. Kant wasn't in a position to do that. But Sellars' conceit in his Locke lectures is to understand that transcendental idealism as scientific realism, to say the natural sciences tell us how things are in themselves. Well, the world in the narrow sense. And everything else in the common sense framework, in the manifest image, everything else is a matter of phenomenal appearance of that world to creatures like us. So Sellars, as metaphysician, says, understanding the relation between these two sides, I suggested sort of 7 disambiguations of it that Sellars has sort of put in play. This is the metaphysical question. It is the philosophical question for us and for our time, for us downstream from Kant's insights. And if you're asking other questions, other metaphysical questions, 90% of the questions of contemporary analytic metaphysics, he's saying, you took your eye off the ball. You're not asking the most important metaphysical question. That's the question of how to fuse these images, how to understand the relation between these so that the real distinctions, the real differences that I've just suggested 7 different ways of drawing, don't turn into a dualism where you can't tell an intelligible story about how they're related. If, for instance, you're Frank Jackson and think the metaphysical question, the form of metaphysical questions is placement problems, that is how to find the truth makers of various bits of discourse in the natural sciences. Well, you're getting close there, but he thinks that's as urgent for colors as it is for norms. And so I was going to say, no, you've missed what the big issue is here. I mean, to tip my hand a little bit, at the end, I want to say that if you find yourself in a position where you're fussed by the Kantian problematic, by asking which features of our experience are as they are because we're as we are, and which of them are as they are because the world that we're knowing about and acting in is as it is, that betrays that you've made a fundamental mistake upstream of the situation in which you asked that question. The right response to the Kantian problematic is a deflationary, deconstructive response to find a presupposition of that that ought to be rejected. But that is not what Sellars thinks. So all of that is something like a pep talk saying, look, the issue that Sellars is addressing, that I hope to have brought us to the position to ask this question now and look hard at what he has to say about it. This is a big deal. You might, in the end, disagree with him that this is the philosophical question. But there's a strong case to be made for it. And even if it isn't, you need to know what to make of the Kantian revolution. So you should have a story about this, even if you think, well, we're in a post-Kantian phase. Well, some of us aspire to move analytic philosophy from its incipient Kantian to its eventual Hegelian phase, and we might think that. But nonetheless, you have to have something to say about this. Okay. Well, let me pause there for a moment. As I say, what's the right response to a pep talk? Well, it's to go out there and do it. Yeah, coach, we're ready. Put me in. I'll do this. That's how you should be feeling at this point. Okay. Sellars introduces the notion of the manifest image. And one thing that I'll remark about this, that I don't believe I've ever seen anybody take and run with in the many discussions that there are of this essay. And I confess, I don't know what to make of it. But if you ask, why is this the manifest image? Why that name for it. Scientific image, okay, well, it's science. He's a scientific naturalist. That's okay. Why is it natural science? Well, material things, there's going to have to be a story there. Why the manifest image for talking about what just a few years later he'll call the common sense framework, and which he could say most of what he says here in those terms? Well, the most prominent use of this term is by Freud, talking about the difference between the manifest content of a dream and the latent content. What's really going on that explains the manifest content of the dream, such that you will only understand the manifest content of the dream if you understand its latent content in terms of the psychodynamics that are on display here and the way they've been triggered by various events in your life. I think it's extremely likely that Sellars picked the term manifest image with that resonance in mind, meaning to invoke that association. As I say, I'm not aware of anybody who has seized on that as the key to a reading of what's going on here. And as I said, I don't myself see quite what to make of it. And it may have just been one of those literary conceits that, when he thought about it, he thought, well, no, I don't know, but what was I thinking? And that's why he gave it up. But at some point, he took this seriously. And it's helpful in one sense that he has a lot of theories about the manifest image that he gives us in this essay, which are not sort of obviously true of the common sense framework, or anyway go well beyond what just talking about the common sense framework would do. And I want to talk about those in just a minute. He's very much aware that he's talking about roughly the same thing that Husserl means by the life world. He wrote his MA thesis on Husserl with Martin Farber. He knows that stuff well. It's, I think, evidently lines up thematically and in many points of detail with Heidegger's distinction between Zuhandensein and Vorhandensein in being in time. Heidegger is very concerned there to distinguish what he calls presence at hand, standard translation of the Vorhanden, the objects as studied by the natural sciences, to contrast that with equipment, his general term for the things that come with their significance in human practice attached to them. The hammer that is the bit of equipment that it is only in relation to the practice of driving nails with it. And at least in Division 1 of Being in Time, here I'm going to give you the 5-sentence summary of what he does in Division 1 of Being in Time. He's saying, don't think of equipment, of things in the life world, as scientific objects that are merely there to be contemplated by us, that we have thrown a cloak of normative significance over, that we have imputed normative significance to them or imbued them with normative significance, as image is like a cloak that a person puts on. No, this is the way things show up to us. It's the primordial form of things, and what you should worry about is the process by which we stripped away that normative significance relative to our practices. The ferocious kind of abstraction we had to do in order to so much as be able to get our minds around the idea of things that are simply there independently of their relation to us and having properties that are just there. Okay. That thought is very much in line with what Sellars is doing here. And I think he knows this, though he's not a reader of Being in Time. That doesn't mean he didn't read it. But I say he has a theory about this, about the manifest image. I keep finding myself wondering why he thinks, A, he's in a position to make all these sweeping claims, and B, why he thinks he needs to. But one of the strong contrasts that he's making is in the manifest image, all inference is made using correlational methods, and distinguishes that from the postulational methods that he sees as distinctive of science. Well, we saw in reading the second half of EPM that the notion of postulating unobservables to explain the antics of observables is very important to him, that he has elaborated views about. In particular, it's a methodological or epistemological distinction, not an ontological one. But he really commits himself here to dividing inference into correlational and postulational methods. And I think the correlational, the idea is, well, the manifest image, that's the image of observables. And what you can notice is correlations among them. That's how you find your way around them. When you start postulating not things that are unobserved, but things that can't be observed, unobservables, only accessible, anyway, by us now, inferentially, postulates in that sense. Then you're over into the scientific image, maybe a primitive version of it, but that's where you are. Now, that is a wildly bold conjecture, I guess. I think it's extremely unlikely that you can assimilate forms of common sense reasoning to correlational methods. I think what he has in mind here is he's doing in a swooshy, hand-wavy sort of way what Foucault does in the opening of the order of things. Oh, all right, in a swooshy, hand-wavy way, but anyway, more carefully than Sellars is trying to do here, where Foucault is contrasting systematic understanding, sort of the best understandings of things in the pre-scientific world, particularly the mind of the 15th century, with the first stirrings of genuine scientific understanding, describing understanding the world in terms of signatures or resemblances among things. As I say, this is the opening of I guess chapter 2 of the Order of Things, where you notice that human brains look like walnuts. And so you think, well, so maybe you can cure headaches by eating walnuts. And the form that your understanding of things takes is accumulating vast numbers of these resemblances, signatures, respects of similarity of things, and trying to exploit them to get some sort of practical grip on things. You do that between the microcosm and the macrocosm if you're downstream from the Greeks in a certain way, but really indiscriminately, as Foucault is describing. That's really correlational. And Foucault describes even moving from lists of signatures to tables that had more than one column lined up. That was a huge advance in systematization of thinking, sort of on the way to genuinely scientific thinking. I think something like that is what Sellars has in mind here. I mean, I mentioned this when we were talking about his views on abstraction. Let me just mention it again. Sellars is all in on identifying the conceptual dimension of the scientific revolution with the postulation of unobservables. When in Empiricism and Abstract Entities, his 1952 early discussion of why empiricists shouldn't admit abstract objects, he says, look, there's only two reasons that empiricists would. And one is if they were directly observable. That is, if when we introspect, we say, well, I grasp meanings, and these are abstract objects. Or if you needed to postulate them to explain something. For instance, to explain my ability to understand something by saying, oh, well, I must have grasped, a form, an idea, something here. He's all in on the idea that the postulation of unobservables is the conceptual core of the scientific revolution. And it's just not clear that that's true. I mean, it's clear that there is a core like that, but if we look at candidates for them, arguably, Galileo's idea that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, picked up by Descartes, moving from geometry to algebra and geometry, and then on to Newton and Leibniz, arguably the use of specifically mathematical abstractions to understand things, give explanations, and so on, is absolutely as core a feature of the new science as postulation of unobservables, whose paradigm is microtheory to explain macrotheory. Forces are both postulated entities and abstract entities. Sellars can allow, as it were, force tropes, sort of the particular electromagnetic repulsion that the microphone is making on the iron in the hemoglobin in my blood, that particular instance of a force, that he can allow. But electromagnetic forces are abstractions. Never mind the use of mathematics in there. So I think we should be suspicious about the extent to which the story turns on the postulation of unobservables. It's just not clear that the credentials for that are better than, well, for abstractions. And I note that it was indispensability arguments that convinced Quine to change sides from being a nominalist to being a realist about, in particular, mathematical abstractions. You just didn't see how to do modern science without them. Sellars says some things about that. Yeah, Harry.
Yeah, this is sort of picking up on some things that I've been puzzling a little bit about. And I suppose it relates to sort of how much this is the question of philosophy, that arises from Kant, or is it a question that philosophy has been grappling with throughout sort of its time? Because when it comes to the postulating unobservables bit, one might think that, well, that's something that Plato and Aristotle are already in the business of doing, with unmoved mover being intricately postulated as a sort of way of explaining the existence of motion. And you could think that in the case of Descartes, and it depends on what one takes Descartes to be, his project to be, but if one thought that the mind-body substance dualism is really meant to sort of cash out that, well, there's two explanatory projects, there's two sciences, they have distinct domains, and then along comes Princess Elizabeth and points out that, well, there's this sort of everyday experience that we have that doesn't sort of fall into knowledge in either way, and then you could sort of build up a scientific versus manifest image sort of division already sort of in play at Descartes' time, where sort of you have two sciences, but then you have sort of this, some sort of manifest image that has sort of dropped out that doesn't fit the scientific image. So I suppose, yeah, I was puzzling about this, and I wasn't sure if this was sort of on your telling of a problem for your telling of Sellars, or a problem already in Sellars. But now it's starting to see that this is already a problem in Sellars.
I think it is. I mean, he's going to say that what Plato and Aristotle were doing was invoking abstractions. And that's something that the perennial philosophy, not just modern philosophy, already does. But the line between postulation of unobservables and abstractions, well, he's going to say the abstractions are the ones that he can give a metalinguistic account of, and that Platonic ideas, Aristotelian forms, those are universals, those are things that ought to be understood metalinguistically, whereas he does not think that microparticles invoked to explain macro phenomena should be understood metalinguistically. Now, he does think laws of nature should be understood metalinguistically. So, and that's already, take those away from Newton, and where are you? I think there are internal problems to this story. To what extent does he need to draw this great big line here? As I said, even just invoking Foucault here, well, there's a lot going on here, and to really boil it down in a responsible way, you can't just be invoking that in a couple of paragraphs along your way. I mean, the other thing, another feature of the manifest image, as he gives it here, is he says it's characterized by an evolution from the original image to the contemporary manifest image. And he thinks these are stages in the development of the manifest image. But here, the key thing about the manifest image is that it's the framework of persons. And that's another way of saying it's the framework of norms, because persons are normative subjects, the subjects of normative statuses and normative attitudes. Being a person is sort of the uber status, normative status. And the difference between the original framework and later versions of the manifest image, and I think he's saying this because he thinks it illuminates the sense in which personhood and normativity are at the center of the manifest image, is that we started off understanding everything as persons. The wind that bloweth as it listeth. Well, it listeth as it wants. Really, that's how the wind is well, yes, and he sees a process of gradual de-anthropomorphizing as characterizing this, as we realize that things are, we make distinctions within the world of things that are still understood in anthropomorphic terms of making sense of what they're doing by attributing beliefs and desires, thinking of them as reasoning practically to what they want, and making divisions into less and less capable and person-like persons, sort of dumber and dumber things until you get to rocks that just want to be where they are. That's why it's hard to move them. And I say, I think that, that there's some go to that just so story. What if that were specifically Western? Does it always happen that way? What turns on this, I think he's, the only point I can see is that he's emphasizing the centrality of these normative categories, centered on persons as the subjects of normative things. But, so I've suggested three things that are really quite specific to his view, and each of them sort of questionable in a way. The correlational observational versus postulational theoretical understanding, this framework of persons, as invoking the normative space, but tied to a story about the de-anthropologizing of things, it's sort of a just so story. Again, contrast it with Max Weber's theory of disenchantment and Zauberung. He did work to make that concept explanatory, and Sellars is just waving his hands here. It's sort of at the level of Fraser's Golden Bough, it seems to me. But he's also, and non-trivially, giving us a theory of modernity, the Hegelian view is it's the one biggest thing that ever happened in human history, is the transition from traditional ways of thinking to distinctively modern ways of thinking. And this is, of course, a modern thought, and the philosophers who developed the fighting faith of modernity, basically our heroes from Descartes to Kant, focused on the rise of science, the rise of the new science as what made the difference. And that's Sellars is taking over that story and saying, yeah, that's what modernity is. It's the result of the transformation that was wrought by the rise of the new science. He goes so far in doing that that he also distinguishes between two kinds of philosophy, two fundamental kinds of philosophy. The traditional kind that he calls perennial philosophy, philosophia perennis, and modern philosophy. And again, he's taking the line that is more explicit in Kant than in his predecessors, but was basically the thought of early modern philosophers, that what distinguished modern philosophy was the rise of the new science, and philosophers needed to understand, given that this was the best way to understand the world around us, what that told us about the nature of the world around us, of understanding, now that we knew that this was the best form of understanding of such things, and what it told us about us as the ones who can understand this way. But can we be understood this way? Those questions set an agenda for a distinctively modern kind of philosophy, which he contrasts with perennial philosophy, which by definition everybody before, say, Descartes had to be doing. Couldn't do anything else before the rise of the new science, except philosophy in the absence of the new science. But a kind of philosophy that he thinks is still done. It's philosophy of the manifest image and with the methods of the manifest image. And at that point, well, he's got a theory about traditional philosophy and how it's different from modern philosophy. And as he says, he would put essentially all continental philosophy in the side of perennial philosophy. For him, not interested in the rise of modern science. But he also puts all forms of common sense philosophy and ordinary language philosophy. Wittgenstein, early and late. Now, he was also a reader of Hegel, and I hold him to account here, though all the great philosophers of the modern period, from Descartes to Kant, were, in essence, philosophers of science, philosophers who were trying to sort out the lessons that we should learn about the world, about knowledge, about us, from the rise of the modern science. And in that sense, were the theorists of the modern, but nobody before Hegel took modernity as an explicit topic of philosophical investigation. And for Hegel, modernity meant a lot more than what was going on in university studies and with the scientists of the day. He saw the rise of science as the theoretical manifestation of a huge sea change that included big economic changes from land being the principal source of wealth to commerce and eventually industry being, that included huge political changes from aristocracies of birth to broadly Republican theories of government, of representative government. And he's the one who set the problem of understanding what for him was the single biggest thing that ever happened in human history, which he theorized as a fundamental change in the nature of normativity. From, the way I put it, the status dependence of normative attitudes, thinking of norms as features of the objective world, that it was the task of human beings to reflect in their attitudes, to practically acknowledge the norms that were binding them, my station and its duties. Two, for Hegel, an appreciation of the attitude dependence of normative statuses, that except insofar as we treat each other as superior and subordinate, as authoritative and responsible, there aren't any of these statuses. That the modern insight was, yeah, we've met the norms and they are ours. They're products of our activity. And in having that idea of a sort of unified phenomenon of which the rise of science and changes in literature were the thematic expressions, but that had all of these other political, economic changes as well. Hegel basically invented modern social science, political economy, and in particular sociology, say. Sellars is willing to go just with the sort of philosophical reading of modernity, and I think missing out on Hegelian insight into shifts in the structure of the norms implicit in social practices that is in a feedback loop with the changes in practices. At any rate, in these early sections of the essay, as sort of, in a certain sense, throwaway lines, he has all these big theories. He divides philosophy into these two kinds of philosophy that one can do. He has a view about what the difference between the modern world and the traditional world is. A view about the evolution of common sense from categories of persons. All of this is thrown in before he really gets to the topic that he's aiming at. Yeah.
I have a question about the relation among these seven ambiguous distinctions. I expect they are by and large corresponding to each other. So although we are talking about the manufacturing and the scientific events, I think we can reasonably expect this discussion can be applied to the distinction between the word in like sense and the word in meta sense. But if we think so, the idea of correlational and postulational distinction seems very weird because I can't see why should we assume that we can figure out the words in the meta sense only by abstraction and postulation.
Right. I mean, I agree. I think that's an odd one out. I think the nominalism, that what's really there consists exclusively of particulars and, well, uh, those things, those particulars in the largest sense, and how they hang together in the largest sense, and not relations, universals, and facts. Why does that line up? Well, because he sees all those as metalinguistic, and what is metalinguistic depends on there being a language for it to be metalinguistic too. No language, no metalanguage. So given that specific reading of all of those things, you can see how this lines up with the world in the narrow sense and world in the wide sense. Where he's going is the claim that natural science tells us about the world in the narrow sense. That's its job. And it's authoritative about what there is in describing what there is. That involves a certain, abstraction from the practice of science. That science turned on itself it isn't going to take us very far. Trying to fit us into that world. Well, this is where he ends the essay, is with the challenge of fitting persons into this world. Where I want to end up is with three strands that I think his account of the relation between these two worlds is. And one of them is the line that Jim O'Shea extracts from his early essay. It says that the world in the broad sense is conceptually irreducible to the world in the narrow sense, but is causally reducible to it. And I think O'Shea is right that that's one of the thoughts that Sellars has. I think another thought, and this is specific to his nominalism, is that natural science gives us the ontology that has to underlie the world in the broad sense. But you need to appeal to the world in the broad sense for the ideology that goes with that ontology. And then the final strategy, the one that he ends the essay with, the fusion of images, is the prospect, the possibility of incorporating the scientific image into the manifest image by replacing all the descriptive and explanatory resources of common sense with the descriptive and explanatory resources of natural science. And his concern there precisely is, most colorfully, if we could do that, would that be a new kind of slavery or a new kind of freedom? Need it entail sui genocide suicide in eliminating the concept of a person that would be genocide in that it would eliminate people. Persons, it's an essential feature of persons that they understand themselves as persons, he says. Need that incorporation of the scientific image have that effect? His view is no. We can't do without the notion of person. But this is where but it is causally reducible, but not conceptually reducible. Well, we'll see how this goes. Okay, we better take 15 minutes now and come back at 2:47. All right. Well, let me say something about the particular form that what Sellars colorfully calls the clash of images takes. Because I think it's not just that there's these two images, sort of pick between them. There's a structure to this, which is there's a sense in which there's a parity between the two images. A sense in which they're on the same level. Each one in particular purports to be a complete story. To say, really, you can say everything in my terms. He says, in 386, and then 388, when we turn our attention to the scientific image, which emerges from the several images proper to the several sciences, we note that although the image is methodologically dependent on the world of sophisticated common sense, and in this sense does not stand on its own feet, yet it purports to be a complete image, to define a framework which could be the whole truth about that which belongs to the image. Thus, although methodologically a development within the manifest image, the scientific image presents itself as a rival image. So, he's seeing implicit in natural science, an all but explicit claim to completeness within its own domain. So let's just say we're talking about Newtonian science. It says, I'm going to tell you everything about things that have mass and respond to forces. Those are two ways of talking about the same things. I'm going to tell you everything about how they move. Kinematics, dynamics, everything described in the language of motion, matter, and force, I'm going to tell you about. That's all but explicit in the aspiration. And he's seeing implicit in it a much stronger completeness claim. That in some sense, that's everything. Now, we've seen that there are various versions that can take. All facts are physical facts. very unlikely to be true. Probably the minimal version of it is a global supervenience claim that if you fix all the facts as specifiable in the language of eventual fundamental physics, that fixes all the facts. That everything that's genuinely true, you couldn't have two worlds in which the facts specified in some other vocabulary were different in the two worlds, but the facts as specified in the language of eventual fundamental physics were the same. So if things could be described, if without a change, without it making any difference to the facts as specified in the language of an eventual fundamental physics, you could have two worlds that matched in that regard, but were different in the aesthetic facts about the beauty of some painting, say, that would show that those weren't real facts, that you were doing something else than fact stating when you used those expressions. That's a sense of completeness. That global supervenience notion wasn't available to Sellars. I would say, insofar as there's a consensus these days, it would be, well, that's probably true, global supervenience of everything on the facts as specified in some ultimate fundamental physics, but it's way too weak to explain the relation between, say, normative vocabulary and the vocabulary of physics, because that global supervenience could hold if the difference between how people ought to behave being settled by a Christian ethos and by a fascist Nazi ethos, on the other hand, required some physical difference, but it was only the position of some photon outside the light cone of human existence. That would be compatible with that moral difference supervening on a physical difference. But we'd say, but it couldn't just turn on where that photon is. It would have to turn on something in the vicinity, something more local than that. Right, well, global supervenience doesn't tell us any more than that. So it doesn't tell us enough about the relation between the facts specified in a normative vocabulary and the facts specifiable in a physical vocabulary. Locus classicus for this argument is an essay called Supervenience and Superdupervenience. What we need is the superdupervenience. We don't know how to do that. So there's a sense in which the natural scientific image purports to be the complete image. It's a complete image of us, possessors of mass and movers through space. Sort of qua that, but somehow anything true that's specified in the normative vocabulary must just be a convoluted way of talking about what's talked about in the language of physics. And I already mentioned, at least in passing in connection with Heidegger, the sense in which the common sense framework purports to be a complete story. After all, the natural scientific story grew up within our normative discursive practices. It's a suburb of those. We can talk about the norms of scientific practice, including the norms of theory generation and evaluation, and all of that's going to happen in the language of norms justification and so on, all stuff that's in the manifest image or the common sense image, or anyway, the norm-drenched vocabulary described in that vocabulary. So the capacity of each one to see the vocabulary of the other one as a region of itself, however we sort of try and make that exact, that's a sense in which they're on a par. And furthermore, at least for us moderns, they're both indispensable. We can't do without the output of natural science is, whatever else it is, the most spectacularly successful social institution of the last 300 years, whose claim to theoretical understanding has been secured not by the scientific revolution, the intellectual revolution, but by the industrial revolution, the business arm of the Enlightenment, as it were. Sort of is the proof in the pudding of the claims to understanding of this way of thinking about things. Can't pretend that isn't so. On the other hand, we can't do without the vocabularies in which we recognize each other and ourselves. Sellars puts this colorfully in various ways, but you can't be a person without taking yourself to be a person. He mentions only relatively late in the sophisticated development of perennial philosophy that Hegel appreciates the extent to which that's a social achievement, but nonetheless, we not only don't know what it would be to live not in the normative discursive space that we do, but arguably it wouldn't be us who was inhabiting that space. At any rate, we're the kind of creature that understands itself as moving in that space. And insofar as that, I mean, this is the basis of, to revert to my hobby horse, Hegel, his distinction of everything into things that have natures and things that have histories. So distinguishing electrons that have natures and the concept of electron that has a history, because the things that have histories are something for themselves. And what they are in themselves depends on what they are for themselves, how they understand themselves, so that a sufficiently radical change in how they understand themselves changes what they really are. And tracking those changes, changing that way, is a historical change. If you're essentially self-conscious in the sense that what you take yourself to be is an essential part of what you really are, then you're subject to this different kind of change than things that have natures are. A cascade of changes where you change what you are by changing what you take yourself to be, how you understand yourself, which of course doesn't make you into what you understand yourself to be. It just makes you into something different. And the thought is creatures like us are time slices that can only understand themselves, or that best understand themselves, by rehearsing that process, the historical process by which we got to where we are. And in that sense, disciplines like philosophy also are of this kind. It's not just persons, but those are historical things. That's what we study in the Geisteswissenschaften, not in the Naturwissenschaften that just look at things that have natures. So Sellars has a view like this. We can't do without the image in which we understand ourselves. He's going to hold out the possibility, could we come to understand ourselves in the language of natural science? And again, if we did, would that be slavery or freedom of a new kind? What would that be? What would that be like? Okay, so the parity of the two images is that each purports to be complete in a sense that includes the other, a different sense of inclusion, of course. And given where we are as moderns, each one is indispensable. Can't do without either one of those images. So there's a certain parity to them. That structural feature of the two images clashes with the claim to primacy of the scientific image over the manifest image. In, as he says in the Scientia Mensura, the dimension of describing and explaining. And here he mentions in passing, but in some sense this is the theme of the whole essay. It's his response to Eddington's lecture about the two tables in his 1929 Gifford lecture, which I put a link to on the website for this week, and it is a classic. It's worth looking at, where Eddington says, there's two tables in front of me. There's this solid, colored, opaque table, and there's the table the way the best current physics tells us it is, that is almost exclusively empty space, containing invisible, because too small, particles, none of which have any color, which are moving at incredibly fast speeds, vibrating and repelling each other. It's not solid, it's not colored. That's a very different table, and that's the real table. It only appears to us as solid and brown and so on, opaque. And though the table, as Eddington thought it really was, turns out not to be the way it is, according to contemporary physics, but we can look to whatever the successor conception is. Scientia Mensura, in the dimension of describing and explaining, science is the measure of all things, of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not. Now, mentioned before how important that preamble is. He's anti-descriptivist. You can do lots of things other than describing. On the other hand, the question of what there is a matter of true descriptions of things. So the primacy is going to be primacy in that dimension, but that is in saying what there is. Now, again, there's an undertone here that there would be no reason for a reader of EPM to pick up when he formulates the scientia mensura there. And that's its nominalist undertone. In the dimension of describing and explaining, science is the measure of all things, read particulars, of what is, of what particulars there are, that they are, not how they are, of what there is, that it is, the existence of the particulars, but not how it is. And what there is not, that it is not. The undertone is he's really seeing a world of particulars here. That's the world in the narrow sense. Now, when he goes to adjudicate this clash, which I'm saying, in one sense, it's a clash of the two images, but really the clash is at this higher level between the sense in which they're on a par, parity of them, and the priority claim. Because he doesn't want to deny the parity in the sense in which each one is claiming it. But natural science still has a priority, descriptive priority. It is, in the Latin phrase, primus inter pares, first among the equals. So how can that be? Now, I asked us to read not just this essay, though it's long and complicated, and even though I try and boil it down by giving you the passages that I think are index passages, I can imagine you looking at that and saying, well, you boiled it down to 16 single-spaced pages of passages. That's still pretty unboiled in many ways, and so I feel your pain. But I suggest we read the O'Shea because it's, I think, a paradigm of how to write usefully and illuminatingly about Sellars. So those of you who are going to try and do that in a term paper, it'd be nice to see it done once in a sort of term paper length compass. O'Shea is following the scholastic advice that I mentioned before, and seeing Sellars as doing that. That is the advice: when faced with a contradiction, make a distinction. Is the manifest image reducible to the scientific image or not? Well, distinguish between conceptual reducibility and causal reducibility. And now you can have your cake and eat it too. You can say it's not conceptually reducible, but it is causally reducible. And O'Shea finds this distinction in one of Sellars' earliest articles, his 52, A Semantical Solution to the Mind-Body Problem, in which he argues that what he'll later call Rileyan states of belief, desire, intention, and so on, are not conceptually reducible to neurophysiologically specifiable states, but they are causally reducible. And O'Shea's plausible claim and diagnosis is that that's the shape of the view that Sellars ends up applying, not just to the mind-body problem, but to the norm material reality problem. Here's a way of thinking about that. Gil Harmon, one of my teachers, wrote a little book in the 80s called Morality, or maybe Moral Theory, in which he argues that we should decide what there is based on a version of the postulational method that he calls inference to best explanation. That what we should be committed to as existing is what we have to mention in our best explanation of phenomena. He says, for instance, in explaining how my watch and the microphone work, I have to make reference to electrons. And so, they're part of the best explanation of the functioning of these devices. So, okay, they really exist. What about moral values? Is there anything, any phenomenon, the best explanation of which is the existence of moral values? Is there a phenomenon that I can't explain without invoking moral values? He says, well, what are the phenomena? Look, I certainly take there to be a difference between helping somebody live a rich and fulfilling life and torturing them to death for my amusement. I certainly take there to be a difference between those things. Baked into our practices are practical attitudes of distinguishing these things. But does the best explanation of those practices and practical attitudes force us to postulate moral values that we're responding to, that are responsible for our practices and attitudes, where our paradigm for that is the way in which explaining how these devices work requires us to postulate electrons, to acknowledge electrons as responsible for my being able to tell the time, record my voice, and so on. And he says, no, there's a huge asymmetry between these, because a perfectly good explanation of my moral attitudes and our moral practices appeals only to other moral attitudes and practices. The practices of my parents, who taught me the difference between right and wrong. The practices of my community that I discuss fine points of this with. But the best explanation of moral attitudes, which are something in the world, I can respond to my taking it that one thing is wrong and the other is right by doing the one and not the other, by criticizing people who do the one and not the other. My attitude is something causally efficacious in the world, but the best explanation for my attitudes needn't go any farther than other people's attitudes. We don't need to postulate anything that those are attitudes towards. That's the Harmon argument. Our moral values, in that sense, they're causally reducible to moral attitudes. All the causal explanations can stop at the attitude, and they don't need to invoke what the attitude is an attitude towards. But that's not true of electrons. It's not enough to invoke my beliefs about electrons, or even the beliefs of the people who designed the watch and the microphone, to explain what they do and how they causally interact with me. I have to postulate that there really are these electrons that move the way we believe them to move. Now, let me urge caution with this Armenian moral Philistineist argument. It depends on what the phenomena are that you're trying to explain. He's presupposing that there aren't any phenomena to explain that can only be specified in normative vocabulary. He's restricting the phenomena to be explained to normative attitudes and saying, well, we can explain those normative attitudes without invoking normative statuses as correct or incorrect, as responsible or not responsible. And that's showing a certain completeness within its own domain of normative attitude talk. But of course, if what you want to understand is the difference between its being wrong to torture someone for your light amusement and it's being right to help them lead a fulfilling life, it's not clear that the attitudes are sufficient to explain that. So we can see where the rabbit was hiding in that argument, I think. It's in the restriction of the data that he allows, specifying that it be specified in non-normative vocabulary. Nonetheless, there's a paradigm of a causal reducibility without claim, without conceptual reducibility. Saying, look, Harman would say, I'm not telling you what morally right and morally wrong mean. I'm not articulating those concepts. I'm just saying you can explain everything about the use of them causally by appealing to other features of the use of them. Now, we're saying there's some things he can't explain causally that way, namely why some of those uses are correct and the others aren't. That had to be ruled out to do this. Nonetheless, there is something that he can causally reduce, but wouldn't claim to conceptually reduce. And it's a view like that that Sellars puts forward in the 52 essay, and that O'Shea appeals to in interpreting the view that Sellars finally comes to. The norm-laden world of common sense is not conceptually reducible to what you can put in the language of natural science. You can't translate what we say in those vocabularies into that language. But you can causally account for everything we say in it. You can causally account for the use of that normative vocabulary in terms of facts that you can state in the language of natural science. That's a way in which one could allow the conceptual parity while holding on to the causal priority of the scientific image over the manifest image. And I think there certainly is that strand in Sellars' view. Let me say, this essay is just his introducing the topic. His extended attempt to solve it is science and metaphysics. That's what he tries to do in his Locke lectures. So, that's where we're going. So, to a certain extent, I don't want to try and put too much weight on the formulations here, because he himself thought of them as preliminary, and in at least one really important regard, fundamentally changed his mind between the two of them. That is, here he says, do the objects of the manifest image really exist? Are they real? And he'd say, speaking as a philosopher, I would say, no, they don't. There are no such things. What there are the objects specified in the language of the natural sciences. He takes that back in science and metaphysics. He says, no, not all the things that we talk about in the manifest image, in common sense, are real, but a lot of them are. But all of them can be specified in the language of physics. All of them show up as appearances of, all the ones that really are hooking up to something real are appearances to us of those objects. That's how the Kantian transcendental idealism is going to take the form of scientific naturalism. But I would say O'Shea has picked out a genuine strand in Sellars' suggestion as to how the parity of the images can be reconciled with a primacy thesis, conceptually on a par, not intertranslatable, but causally there's a priority. If you want to give causal explanations of, for instance, the use of normative vocabulary, that he's aspiring to be able to do in the language of natural science. A theme that is in play here, not clearly distinguished from the other one, is what I meant labeled earlier as a distinction between ontology and ideology. The language of the natural sciences is going to tell us what there is there to refer to, the ontology. It's not going to translate what we can say about it in the common sense normative vocabulary. That is, you're not going to be able to reproduce the sense, only the referent. The primacy of the natural scientific vocabulary is for specifying the reference, ENTS, the particulars that we refer to, what we're talking about. But that doesn't mean that the language of natural science has to be able to say about them everything we can say about them in the norm-laden language. That's the ideology, what's true of them. That's a matter of sense, not of reference. And that's the level at which they're on a par. They're two different ideologies, but in the dimension of describing, of saying what we're referring to, we're talking about, the natural scientific has to have a priority. Now look, this is radical enough. It is saying there really is no such thing as a price in the stock market. because that isn't going to be identifiable with something that you can specify in the language of natural science. That's only in the world in the broad sense. Well, so you're telling me it doesn't have any causal effect? Gee, I got wiped out in the catastrophe that we had here. I wouldn't have flung myself out of the window of the stock exchange if that hadn't happened. Well, we're going to have to see sort of what he says about this in the more careful way of speaking. But I think here, and this is also a theme that he takes over into the later work. And then finally, there's the official view that he gives us really just in the last section of this essay. Really speculation, but would it be possible for us to alter the common sense framework, keeping people in it and norm talk in it, but taking over the descriptive and explanatory apparatus and exclusively relying on the descriptive and explanatory resources of the eventual natural scientific vocabulary? What would that, is that an intelligible possibility? Would that be giving up persons? We wouldn't be able to refer to persons, but there's more to life than describing. We could recognize each other. That's not described, as persons, is taking up a normative stance toward them, not describing them. Could we do that? Well, still, all there is to refer to is basically your central nervous system, he says in this. That's going to be the scientific thing that's available to be referred to. Okay, well, all of this is just supposed to open up the topic that is with us for the rest of the term as we start to read the Locke lectures. Sellars had the conceit when he wrote the Locke lectures of mirroring the opening of Kant's critique. And so his first lecture is his analog of the transcendental aesthetic, talking about categories of space and time. And that's the lecture that 400 people came to, and only 8 people came to the second one. And when his former student, Akil Bilgrami, asked John McDowell what he wanted to do his Woodbridge lectures at Columbia on, he said, I'm going to talk about the first chapter of Sellars' Science and Metaphysics. And Akil said to his beloved teacher, "Oh, I'm so glad you told me that. I'll book a much smaller room." And I myself, having spent a lot of time in this book that we're going on to read, could never make anything at all of that first chapter. I mean, nothing. And after many readings, and the thought of somebody hearing it as a lecture, and John McDowell, who was there for the actual lecture, said, oh, he didn't understand a word of it. But he did 2 or maybe 3 Woodbridge lectures on it. And I've linked to those. I finally think I know what's going on in the Sellars from John explaining it to me. So I'm not asking you to read the first chapter of Science and Metaphysics, and only if you're sort of interested, read the McDowell of it. But it's there, and since we're not going to read the essay, I thought you should have access to the McDowell version of it. But work on chapter 2. It will be worth it. Okay. See you next time.